In the spring of 1947, inside a quiet courtroom in Nuremberg, prosecutors were still uncovering the machinery of the Third Reich. There were documents about gas chambers, orders signed for deportations, blueprints for camps. But among the files was something stranger, a program, not for killing, for breeding. It was called Lebensborn, Fountain of Life. It had been founded on December 12, 1935. Its creator was not a battlefield general, not a frontline commander. It was the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, and he believed Germany's future would not be won with tanks, but in maternity wards. By the time Allied forces entered Norway and Poland in 1945, thousands of children were living in state-run homes tied to the SS. Some had blonde hair and blue eyes. Some had been taken from their parents. Many had no idea who they really were. Some of them are still alive today. They were born for a dream, a racial dream. And when that dream collapsed, they were left behind. In 1935, Nazi Germany was rearming, rewriting treaties, and consolidating power. But inside SS headquarters in Berlin, another kind of planning was underway. It wasn't about tanks. It wasn't about borders. It was about birth rates. Heinrich Himmler had become Reichsführer SS in 1929. By the mid-1930s, he had transformed the SS from a 280-man guard unit into an ideological order of more than 50,000 members. But to him, even that wasn't enough. He didn't want an army. He wanted a bloodline. Germany's demographic statistics haunted him. After World War I, nearly 2 million German men were dead. The Weimar years had brought economic collapse and falling birth rates. By 1933, the average German family had fewer children than in the previous generation. To most politicians, that meant economic reform. To Himmler, it meant racial extinction. He believed history was biological competition. Nations didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with wombs. If racially valuable Germans failed to reproduce in sufficient numbers, the Reich would decay from within. He read demographic projections obsessively. In his speeches to SS leaders, he warned that Germany faced a silent crisis, not invasion, but dilution. And dilution, in his worldview, was irreversible. By 1935, the SS had already become a racial screening mechanism. Any officer who wished to marry had to submit an application through the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. Proof of Aryan ancestry back to at least 1800 was required. Genealogical charts were checked. Church records examined. Marriage was no longer private. It was state-approved genetics. Then, on December 12, 1935, Himmler signed the order establishing Lebensborn, officially a charitable association under SS control. The name meant Fountain of Life. The paperwork described a welfare initiative to support pregnant women of good blood. It promised maternity care, financial assistance, and protection from social stigma. But behind that language was something far more radical. Lebensborn was a demographic weapon. It was designed to increase the number of children who fit Nazi racial criteria, especially those fathered by SS men. This was the positive counterpart to the regime's darker policies. In 1933, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring had legalized forced sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit. By 1935, thousands had already been sterilized. Now came the inverse strategy: eliminate some, encourage others. Reproduction had become state policy. The first Lebensborn home opened in Steinhöring, Bavaria in 1936. It looked serene: white walls, orderly nurseries, professional staff. But entry required documentation of ancestry, racial examination, and approval by SS authorities. Women were measured, their physical features evaluated, family histories scrutinized. If approved, they were welcomed. If not, they were excluded from the future. By the late 1930s, Several such homes operated across Germany. The SS was no longer simply guarding the Reich. It was attempting to engineer it, and war would soon give that experiment new territory. Lebensborn was never only about children. It was about women, about who qualified, who was examined, who was approved, and who was quietly rejected. By 1936, when the first Lebensborn home opened in Steinhering near Munich, the regime had already begun redefining motherhood as a political act. Nazi propaganda glorified the image of the racially pure German mother, healthy, fertile, devoted to the folk. But behind the posters and medals was something colder: selection. Every woman who applied to a Lebensborn home entered a screening process designed not for care, but for classification. The racial evaluation was systematic. Applicants had to submit detailed genealogical documentation, birth certificates of parents and grandparents, sometimes reaching back to the early 19th century. Any hint of Jewish ancestry, Slavic lineage, in early phases, hereditary illness, or political unreliability could disqualify them. Then came the physical examination. Doctors trained in racial anthropology evaluated skull shape, facial symmetry, nasal structure, eye color, hair texture, body proportions. Measurements were taken. Notes recorded. Some files included photographs attached to racial assessment forms. The criteria were not medically grounded in modern science, but at the time, they were treated as authoritative. If a woman was approved, she was categorized as racially valuable. If she was rejected, she simply disappeared from the process. No appeal. Himmler did not hide the fact that SS men were expected to reproduce. By the late 1930s, the SS had become a self-contained caste. Officers were screened for ancestry. Marriage required permission. Even engagement required review. But war complicated morality. Many SS officers had relationships outside marriage. In traditional German society, unmarried pregnancy carried stigma. Himmler considered that stigma counterproductive. If the father was genetically valuable, the child must be born. In a letter written in 1938, Himmler stated that even if an SS man fathered a child outside wedlock, he had a duty to acknowledge and support it, particularly if the mother met racial standards. Lebensborn offered the solution. Women could give birth discreetly in SS-run facilities. Their pregnancies were shielded from public shame. The child could be raised by the mother or placed for adoption into an approved German family, often another SS household. The biological chain would continue. Respectability was secondary. Blood was primary. The popular image suggests that every Lebensborn mother was a committed Nazi ideologue. The reality was more complicated. Some were deeply aligned with Nazi racial beliefs. They saw participation as patriotic. Others were pragmatic. Germany in the late 1930s and early 1940s was tightly controlled. Social pressure was intense. Economic insecurity was real. For a young woman pregnant outside marriage, options were limited. Lebensborn provided medical care, financial support, secrecy, protection from public humiliation. For some women, it was less about ideology and more about survival. In occupied Norway after 1940, the situation grew even more complex. Relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women ranged from consensual romance to coercion. Some women believed Germany would win the war and sought stability. Others fell in love. Others had few economic alternatives. When pregnancy followed, Lebensborn facilities offered structure. The program's expansion into Norway was rapid. By 1945, several homes operated there, including facilities in Oslo, Bergen, and other regions. Norway would ultimately see more Lebensborn births than Germany itself. These women were later condemned as collaborators. But in many cases, their decisions were shaped by circumstance rather than ideology. History tends to flatten nuance. Reality rarely does. Lebensborn homes were designed to appear respectable. White curtains, orderly nurseries, professional midwives. But discretion was central. Many births were deliberately shielded from public records in the traditional sense. The SS maintained its own documentation systems. Children could be registered under new arrangements. In adoption cases, files were sealed. The aim was twofold: protect the mother from stigma, control the child's future placement. By 1939, approximately 8,000 children had been born in German Lebensborn homes. The numbers increased significantly during the war years, particularly with the inclusion of occupied territories. The atmosphere inside the homes varied. Some former residents later described environments that felt calm and well organized. Others reported emotional distance, as if the child was less an individual and more an asset. The staff were not random volunteers. They were trained and vetted. Many were ideologically aligned nurses and administrators who believed they were contributing to a national mission. Being approved by Lebensborn carried social implications. The SS was increasingly positioned as an elite order within the Reich. Its members enjoyed privileges, better housing, prestige, internal networks. Women connected to SS fathers could, in certain contexts, access that elite status indirectly. Children born under Lebensborn protection were sometimes described internally as part of the future racial vanguard. There was an almost aristocratic undertone to it, a sense that these births were not merely personal events, but investments in the thousand-year Reich. Himmler envisioned SS families expanding across conquered territories. He encouraged large households. In internal discussions, he spoke of demographic planning stretching decades ahead. Motherhood became strategic. The womb became policy. One of the most striking elements of Lebensborn was its bureaucratic calm. There were no dramatic speeches inside the maternity wards, no banners, just forms, charts, examinations. The normalization of racial engineering made it more dangerous. The women were not always treated harshly. Many received attentive medical care. That, paradoxically, made the program easier to justify to participants. It did not feel like extremism. It felt like structure. And that is what allowed it to grow. By the early 1940s, Lebensborn had become an established institution within SS administrative culture. It functioned smoothly. It expanded quietly. It framed itself not as radical, but as responsible. And that framing masked what it truly represented: the transformation of reproduction into state strategy. Lebensborn began with mothers who volunteered. War would soon bring children who did not. The shift did not happen overnight. At first, Lebensborn focused on births within the Reich. Approved mothers, approved fathers, approved paperwork. But war changed the scale. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, it was not only territory that fell under Nazi control, it was population. And population meant selection. In October 1939, Heinrich Himmler was appointed Reich Commissioner for the Strengthening of Germandom. The title masked what the role truly meant: authority over demographic engineering in occupied territories. Himmler now controlled who could be classified as German and who could be removed. The racial dream had crossed a border. Poland became the first large-scale testing ground. Nazi racial theorists believed that centuries of migration had mixed bloodlines across Eastern Europe. Among Poles, they argued, there were children of Germanic origin whose ancestry had been diluted by history. These children, in Nazi ideology, were not truly Polish. They were lost Germans. The SS began systematic racial screenings in orphanages, schools, and sometimes entire villages. Special commissions evaluated children between the ages of roughly 2 and 12. They measured skulls, examined hair pigmentation, compared eye color to classification charts, inspected teeth and bone structure. Children were categorized into groups, from valuable to unfit. Those deemed racially desirable were removed. Sometimes officials told parents the child would receive education in Germany. Sometimes, no explanation was given. In many documented cases, children were taken abruptly, placed in transit camps, and transported west. Their names were Germanized. Jan became Johann. Zofia became Sophie. Birth dates were sometimes altered to ease integration. According to post-war estimates by Polish authorities, between 20,000 and 200,000 Polish children were subjected to Germanization policies. The exact number remains debated among historians due to incomplete records and wartime chaos. But even conservative estimates confirm thousands who vanished. Not all abducted children went directly into German homes. Many passed through screening centers such as the camp in Łódź, then renamed Litzmannstadt, where racial classification was conducted again. Children who cried for their parents were noted as difficult to assimilate. Older children who remembered Polish language and identity were often rejected from Germanization and instead sent to forced labor facilities. Younger ones, especially toddlers, were preferred. They adapted faster. They forgot faster. One surviving testimony from a Polish victim, later identified through archives, described being taken at age 4. She remembered a train ride, strangers speaking German, and a new name she did not recognize. Her original identity was recovered decades later through documentation stored in German archives. Many never recovered theirs. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, the logic shifted slightly. Nazi racial ideology considered Scandinavians among the purest Germanic populations in Europe. There was no need to abduct Norwegian children in large numbers the way it happened in Poland. Instead, the strategy emphasized encouragement and absorption. Relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women produced thousands of children. Some were the result of romance. Others were transactional. Some involved coercion. These children were frequently registered through Lebensborn facilities established in Norway. By war's end, Norway had more Lebensborn homes than Germany itself. But Norway was not immune to removal policies. Some children born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers were transferred to Germany for adoption into SS families. In other cases, children considered especially valuable were sent to Reich institutions for further evaluation. The difference from Poland was scale and tone. In Poland, children were taken from Polish families. In Norway, children were often taken from Norwegian mothers under administrative or political pressure, especially near the war's end when German retreat created chaos. After 1945, these children became targets of resentment. But during the occupation, they were viewed as demographic assets. In Yugoslavia, the situation was more fragmented. After the Axis invasion in April 1941, the region was divided into occupation zones. In areas under direct German control, racial selection policies operated in tandem with brutal anti-partisan campaigns. Children in certain regions were screened, particularly in Slovenia and parts of Croatia. Nazi authorities considered segments of the Slovenian population racially suitable for Germanization. Thousands of Slovenians were deported for forced labor or resettlement. Some children were separated from families and placed in German institutions if classified as racially valuable. The documentation from Yugoslavia is less centralized than in Poland, but survivor testimonies and archival material confirm the pattern. Selection, separation, reclassification. If you fit the chart, you could be absorbed. If you did not, you could be displaced, or worse. The kidnapping program did not operate like a chaotic raid. It was administrative. Forms were completed, transport lists created, files updated. Children were photographed, measurements recorded, medical notes attached. In some cases, adoptive parents in Germany were told the child was an orphan from the East. They were rarely informed that living parents might still be searching. The erasure was systematic. Original documents were confiscated, new birth certificates issued. Church records sometimes altered to reflect German identity. Language instruction was strict. Speaking Polish or Slovenian could result in punishment. Memory itself became dangerous. Numbers tell part of the story, but the psychological impact cannot be quantified easily. Imagine being 6 years old, being told your parents are gone, being given a new name, being punished for speaking your first language, being told that your past never existed. Many children adapted because children must survive. Some formed attachments to adoptive families. Others never felt secure again. After the war, when efforts were made to locate abducted children, the process was agonizing. In Poland, recovery teams used surviving documentation to trace German placements. Some children were identified and returned. But what does returned mean when identity has been rewritten? There were cases in which a child no longer recognized their biological parents. Cases where the biological parents had been killed in camps. Cases where the adoptive German family refused to surrender the child. Every outcome carried trauma. One of the most disturbing aspects of the kidnapping program is how little public awareness existed during the war. Neighbors sometimes saw children disappear. Rumors circulated. But the machinery of occupation, censorship, and terror suppressed resistance. For Himmler, this was not a side project. It was central to long-term racial restructuring. While extermination policies aimed to remove those deemed undesirable, Germanization policies aimed to reclaim those considered salvageable. The two systems operated in parallel. One destroyed identity by killing. The other destroyed identity by rewriting. Both were forms of erasure. By 1944 and 1945, as German forces retreated, the documentation system began to fragment. Some records were destroyed. Others were abandoned. Children remained scattered across Germany and occupied territories. When Allied forces advanced, they discovered not only camps and prisons, but also administrative archives detailing population transfers. The kidnapping program was no longer theoretical. It was traceable, but not fully reversible. Because even if a child was found, something had already been altered: language, memory, trust. If you looked Aryan enough, you could be stolen. That was the logic, not because of who you were, but because of how you appeared. War did not just redraw borders, it redrew childhood. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe did not wake up to peace. It woke up to reckoning. Cities were rubble, borders were unstable, millions were displaced, and scattered across Norway, Germany, Poland, and beyond were thousands of children whose very existence had been tied to the racial ideology of the Third Reich. They had not chosen anything, but they would pay for it. In Norway, the anger surfaced almost immediately. For 5 years, the country had lived under German occupation. Collaboration, real or perceived, carried explosive emotional weight. Women who had relationships with German soldiers were singled out. They were called Tiskertoser, German girls. Crowds gathered. Heads were shaved publicly in town squares. Some were beaten. Others were detained in improvised camps. There was no due process. It was humiliation as purification. And their children, born during the occupation, were labeled Tiskerbarn, German children, Nazi children. The stigma attached instantly. Between 8,000 and 12,000 children had been born in Norway, under German occupation. Many registered through Lebensborn facilities. In the emotional aftermath of liberation, these children were no longer seen as innocent civilians. They were seen as evidence. In internal Norwegian government discussions from the late 1940s, officials debated what to do with them. Some proposed deporting them to Germany. Others even floated the idea of sending large groups abroad, to Australia, to remove the problem from Norwegian society. These discussions were not rumors. They were documented. Many children were placed in orphanages or state institutions. Some were sent to psychiatric facilities based on the now discredited belief that they might inherit degenerate or unstable traits. They were school-aged by the late 1940s. And classrooms can be cruel. Survivor testimonies collected decades later describe systematic bullying, being called Nazi spawn, being isolated at school, teachers who ignored abuse. Some were physically assaulted. Some were told their existence was a national shame. The irony was brutal. The Nazi regime had treated them as racial assets. Post-war society treated them as contamination. Inside Germany itself, the situation was different, but not simpler. Lebensborn homes had been evacuated or dismantled during the final months of the war. Records were scattered. Staff attempted to blend into civilian life. Children born in German facilities often remained with their mothers or adoptive families. Many grew up unaware of the program's broader implications. But as the reality of Nazi crimes emerged, concentration camps, extermination policies, genocide, anything associated with SS institutions became toxic. Some parents concealed the origins of their children. Files were hidden. Conversations avoided. An entire generation grew up in a country trying not to speak about what had just happened. In Poland, the trauma followed a different trajectory. After liberation, Polish authorities launched efforts to locate children abducted for Germanization. It was an enormous task. Records were incomplete. Some had been destroyed deliberately. Recovery commissions worked through surviving documentation, interviewing families, searching for children placed with German foster parents. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they arrived too late. There were cases where children were found living with German families who insisted they had been adopted legally. In other cases, the biological parents had perished in camps or forced labor. For the child, there was no clean resolution. Some were returned to Poland and had to relearn a language they had been punished for speaking. Some never felt fully at home again. In either country, identity had been fractured, and fracture does not heal quickly. As Europe struggled socially, the legal reckoning unfolded in Nuremberg. Between 1947 and 1948, during what became known as the RuSHA trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, officials connected to SS racial policy and settlement programs were prosecuted. Evidence included documentation of forced population transfers, racial classification systems, and child removals. The court acknowledged the role of Lebensborn in facilitating Germanization and supporting racial policy. But here came the controversy. Lebensborn itself was not declared a criminal organization in the same sweeping way as the SS. Several defendants associated with it were acquitted or received comparatively light sentences. The reasoning rested on legal distinctions. The prosecution struggled to prove that every aspect of Lebensborn's administrative structure constituted a criminal enterprise in the same direct manner as extermination programs. Maternity care, adoption services, and documentation, in isolation, could be framed as welfare activity. The court focused primarily on forced removals and racial persecution in other branches of the SS. To many observers, this felt insufficient. The program that had facilitated identity erasure and child kidnapping had not been condemned with the same clarity as other Nazi institutions. It created an uncomfortable truth. Something can be morally catastrophic without fitting neatly into legal categories. That tension lingers. For the children, legal outcomes meant little. What mattered was daily life. In Norway, decades passed before public attitudes softened. Many war children reported discrimination into adulthood, difficulties finding employment, stigma in marriage, psychological trauma. In 2007, after years of campaigning by survivors, the Norwegian government issued a formal apology for the treatment of these children in the post-war years. An apology came, but it came 60 years late. In Poland and other Eastern European countries, the search for identity continued into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Archival research and, later, DNA testing helped reconnect some individuals with biological relatives. Others never found answers. Some discovered their origins only after the death of the parents who had raised them. Some preferred not to know, because knowing meant confronting the fact that your existence had once been part of a demographic experiment. Here is where the story unsettles. Lebensborn did not build gas chambers. It did not operate killing fields. But it participated in something quieter, the re-engineering of human identity. After 1945, society punished the visible collaborators. It struggled to address the invisible victims, and the legal system, bound by definitions and statutes, could not fully resolve the moral weight. The children were innocent. The mothers were complex. The bureaucracy was methodical. The ideology was lethal. And the verdicts were ambiguous. That ambiguity is what lingers, because it forces a question that has no simple answer. When a state turns birth into policy and identity into paperwork, who exactly is guilty, and who carries the consequences? At the center of Himmler's demographic vision was a vast blueprint known as Generalplan Ost, the general plan for the East. Drafted in stages between 1940 and 1942 by SS planners and racial theorists, it outlined the radical restructuring of Eastern Europe. The numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of people across Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia were designated for displacement, forced labor, or eventual elimination over a 20 to 30-year period. Not overnight. Gradually. Systematically. In their place, the plan envisioned millions of German settlers. Not random migrants. Selected families. SS families. The East was to become a colonial frontier, populated by racially approved Germans, who would create agricultural estates, fortified settlements, and hereditary enclaves of power. It was medieval expansion, executed with filing cabinets. Himmler did not imagine the SS as a temporary military organization. He imagined it as a caste, an order that would reproduce itself across generations. In internal discussions, he urged SS officers to father at least 4 children, preferably more. Reproduction was framed not as private life, but as service to the Reich. Marriage rules remained strict, but Himmler's wartime correspondence reveals a striking flexibility when racial criteria were met. If a child strengthened the genetic stock of the future elite, legitimacy was secondary. He believed the SS would one day function like a new aristocracy, a biological nobility. Titles would not be granted by monarchs. They would be inherited through ancestry charts stored in SS archives. Genealogy became destiny. The occupied East was imagined as a demographic canvas. Polish farmland would be redistributed, Slavic populations reduced or relocated. German farmsteads would rise in grid patterns across annexed territories. Children born under programs like Lebensborn were seen as seeds for that future. Himmler spoke frequently about land and blood in the same sentence. To him, territory without the right population was meaningless. Victory meant more than raising a flag. It meant altering the ethnic composition permanently. SS planning documents projected that within 25 years, entire regions could be transformed into majority German zones if population transfers and birth incentives were sustained. 25 years. That was the timeline. A generation. The vision was chilling, not because it was chaotic, but because it was calculated. Demographic experts within the SS produced projections on birth rates, fertility ratios, and settlement density. They mapped how many German families would be required per square kilometer to shift ethnic balance. Children were units in a statistical forecast. If enough racially approved births occurred each year and enough non-German populations were removed or subordinated, then over decades the map would change quietly. Not by dramatic conquest, by arithmetic. Himmler believed this was more durable than military victory. Borders could shift in war. Bloodlines once embedded would endure. Himmler's long game was not purely bureaucratic. It had a quasi-religious dimension. He saw the SS as guardians of a mythic Germanic destiny. The idea of hereditary continuity was wrapped in language about ancient nobility and ancestral duty. He encouraged SS families to trace lineage back centuries. He sponsored research into Germanic history. He cultivated ceremonies that reinforced the idea of belonging to something timeless. Lebensborn fit into that mythology. It was framed internally not just as welfare, but as renewal, a purification of Europe through controlled reproduction. In this worldview, individual choice mattered less than historical mission. Children were born into destiny. But demographic transformation requires stability. And by late 1943, stability was collapsing. The Eastern Front was bleeding manpower. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities. Resources once imagined for long-term settlement were diverted to immediate survival. The SS continued documentation. Births were still recorded. But the grand colonial future began to fracture under military reality. The settlements envisioned in Generalplan Ost were never fully implemented at the projected scale. The dream required total victory, and total victory never arrived. Himmler's vision reveals something unsettling. The most extreme ideas were not spontaneous acts of rage. They were long-term projects, drafted in offices, supported by charts, signed with fountain pens. Lebensborn was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a continental redesign, a future in which Europe would be reordered not simply by ideology, but by heredity. It was a utopia built on subtraction and replacement. And like many utopias, it underestimated collapse. By 1945, the Reich was disintegrating faster than any demographic model could adjust. The aristocracy of blood never materialized. The settlements were abandoned, the files remained. When Himmler was captured in May 1945, he carried forged identification. He had planned Europe for 50 years. He could not plan his own final week. The cyanide capsule he bit down on ended his long game instantly. But the consequences of that planning did not vanish. Because once you reduce human beings to components of a statistical future, the damage persists beyond the ideology that created it. Himmler believed he was engineering eternity. Instead, he engineered trauma. When the war ended, the Reich collapsed in weeks, but the paperwork remained. Boxes of Lebensborn files were seized by Allied forces, birth records, adoption papers, racial evaluation forms, names that were never meant to be found again. For years, those documents gathered dust. Lebensborn had not operated gas chambers. It had not left piles of bodies. Compared to Auschwitz, it seemed administrative, almost secondary. But inside those folders were stolen identities, children who had been renamed, families that had been erased, birth certificates rewritten to fit ideology. And those children grew up. Some in Germany, never told the truth. Some in Norway, carrying a label they didn't understand, Nazi child. Some in Poland, raised under a different name, in a different language, in a different history. By the 1980s and 1990s, survivors began opening the archives. They searched for original names, for parents, for proof. Some found it, a faded record, a transport list, a racial assessment form with their childhood photograph clipped to the corner. Others found nothing. Because identity, once bureaucratically erased, does not always leave a trail. Then came DNA testing. Decades after Himmler tried to engineer bloodlines through charts and skull measurements, genetics began revealing truths he could never have controlled. A German pensioner discovering Polish ancestry. A Norwegian woman finding half-siblings across borders. A family reunited after 50 years because a database matched strands of DNA. Science, once twisted into racial pseudoscience, became a tool for reconstruction. That is the quiet irony. The regime that obsessed over blood could not contain it. Lebensborn was not the deadliest Nazi program. But it revealed something essential. The Third Reich did not only want to kill its enemies, it wanted to redesign the future, to decide who should be born, who should be taken, who should be rewritten. And that kind of power does not end neatly with surrender papers, because the question it raises is larger than one regime. What happens when a state claims authority over identity at birth? Himmler believed he was building eternity. Instead, he left behind children searching for their real names. And in the end, the archives told a different story than the ideology ever could. Not about purity, but about loss. If this story surprised you, or made you uncomfortable, that's exactly why it matters. Because the past isn't just about what happened. It's about what humans are capable of convincing themselves is necessary. If you want more deep dives into the darker chapters of history, the stories behind the headlines, the documents behind the myths, subscribe to the channel. We don't just tell history here, we examine it. And sometimes, we confront it. I'll see you in the next story.